I want to welcome everyone here tonight. My name is Jason Michelli. I'm joined by Tier Hardy, Josh, and Tony. And Tommy is going to join us at some point here tonight, I believe. Just assuming that we don't need to do this every week, but guys, introduce yourselves to people. Tony, go.
Well, let's see. I'm a semi-retired UCC pastor. I still do some work consulting and doing a project with Vancouver School of Theology. I have written a bunch of books, and I'm always thought of myself as neither adequately pitched in either the liberal or the conservative camp. William Sloane Coffin described Union Seminary, where I went years before I was there, as a liberal evangelical school, and I kind of like that mix.
Good. That's good. Josh.
Josh Moneykeisen. I'm a licensed local pastor in the United Methodist Church, and I'm just here to enjoy the show.
Tommy, say hi. You're muted, Tom.
There we go. Sorry about that.
It's all right. So tell us who you are and a little bit about yourself.
My name is Tommy, and I am the producer over at Crackers Grape Juice. I do all the editing. Outside of that, I am a mom and a photographer.
And a photographer, you said?
Yes, sir.
She's a very good photographer. She can make me look good.
Presentable.
Tier, bring it home. Who are
Tier
you?
Hardy. Tier Hardy. I am one member of the Crackers and Grape Juice team. I am a pastor, and I serve a lovely congregation outside of Washington, D.C. and Arlington, Virginia, Mount Olivet United Methodist Church.
Oh, geez, I used to go to dances there when I was a kid.
So I've heard about that, and we've been learning about that over the last year. Apparently, the church I serve was one of the only places that had integrated dances for the community. Other places you would go dancing, which I didn't grow up going dancing. White kids went one way and black kids went another way. So you danced in the church basement, Tony?
That place was packed every night, every Friday night after a football game. I mean, it was sweaty body to sweaty body. Yeah.
On that note,
yes.
We do. There is already one question, Jason, from Joni Taylor. She would like to know if Josh is going to sing us in again.
It's funny.
Which means I'm guessing he's done that before.
So in previous classes, we somehow got into the habit of Josh beginning with a song. And so I know there's people like Joni will miss that if they've joined us for previous classes. So I'm going to give it over to Josh. And if the rest of you, this is a new thing, and you decide that you don't like it, you're going to have to make a lot of noise for us to stop. And, Tommy is also a good singer, so we could like mix it up here a little bit. That terrifies her, I think. So Josh, you've got like a Wes Anderson look going on with the shirt. So I don't know if you have like a Steve Zissou song for us, but take it away.
I hate to disappoint. I am on the family computer right now because as I was setting up I have kind of like a little Zoom station, but apparently that computer that's on needs an update or something. So I had to switch gears and move, and I'm not prepared to sing.
You let me go through that whole spiel, and you're not.
I know. I thought Tommy was going to swoop in and
all right,
sing something pretty. Next week,
dive right into the book. So our plan, if you got the email today, we're going to spend a little time, just the five of us here, talking about a chapter each week, and then we're going to turn it over to the large group. And so if you have questions, you can wait till the end, or you can put them in the chat or the Q&A as we go along. And so my first question, Tony, is why you wanted to do a study of this book.
Oh, I think it's just a great, it's a great read. You know, it's actually a fun book to read. And I can't say that about too many books in the religion field. And even more, or even those that attempt to be kind of a Christian basics. This is a Christian basics of a sort, but of a very different sort. It's, it's talking about the emotional experience, what Jonathan Edwards called the Christian affections, as opposed to kind of laying out a series of concepts. But I just think he's a terrific writer, both fiction and nonfiction. I love his novels, and that he expresses, to me, a very accessible but not unchallenging presentation of Christian faith, the gospel.
That's good. Yeah, I would agree. This isn't. I've got. This is not going to be like a Bible study or anything each week, but I think one of the ways I wanted to begin the class is by giving a little historical theological overview that I think informs the whole content of the book. And you guys can jump in if you would like at any point. But behind the scenes of this book is one of the oldest, nastiest fights in the history of the Christian church. And so in the 4th century, there was a dispute between a guy named Pelagius, who was a British monk and theologian in Britain, and St. Augustine, who was a convert to Christianity, who was a famous philosopher prior to his conversion, went on to become a theologian and a bishop in the church. And he's probably the most important theologian for Western Christianity, both Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. And so most people are informed by St. Augustine, whether they know it or not. So Pelagius and Augustine got into a bitter dispute. Pelagius lost and was declared a heretic in 418, which, note the date, was the same year that he died. But Pelagianism, though it was declared a heresy, was never fully extinguished. And Tony, our friend, Fleming Rutledge, she's got a quote in her book on the crucifixion that semi-Pelagianism is the default religion, the default Christianity in most churches today. So it was declared a heresy, but it was never fully stamped out because we're kind of hardwired to think that way. And Pelagius basically said that human beings are basically good. We may sin, we may not be perfect, but basically we're good people. So that's point one. Point two, Pelagius argued that if we were not able to do the teachings of Jesus or perform the works of the law in the Old Testament, then God and Christ would not have told us to do them. So that commands exist in the Old and New Testament, Pelagius thought, meant that God expected us to do them. And if God expected us to do them, if Jesus expected us to love our neighbor, then we must have the capacity to do so. Augustine, because of his own personal biography, had a more acute understanding of human sinfulness and finitude. Augustine thought that we are most often strangers to ourselves. Augustine thought that when we do good, it's often out of a mixture of motives. Sometimes it's altruistic, other times it's out of self-interest or fear or a desire for self-preservation, and that we aren't always aware of those mixed motives or able to parse them out. Augustine's problem with Pelagianism, it wasn't so much scriptural or theological, but that's how it gets framed. Like when Tyr learns about Pelagianism in seminary, that's how it gets framed. Augustine thought psychologically on a pastoral level that it was damaging, that you were expecting perfection of people who were incapable of performing it. And this gets picked up in Spufford's book, in the first chapter when he refers to cruel optimism. He quotes St. Augustine, and that quote goes back to this dispute between Augustine and Pelagius. That Pelagius's optimism about what human nature is capable of turns out to be cruel, because in the end, Augustine thought people can't really do the Jesus thing perfectly, and if you expect them to do it, you're setting them up for failure. So that's that. Just a little historical detour. Tony, would you add anything to that?
Well, just that it'll become more obvious as we go along in what sense Spufford is not a Pelagian, but particularly next week's chapter on the HPTFTU, I think that's it, that he sees all of us as sinners in need of grace, a very Pauline idea of very Augustinian that Augustine picks up on it, and whereas Pelagianism kind of, I've always liked the whole observation, which is kind of also anti-Pelagian. The world is not divided between saints and sinners, but between sinners who believe themselves to be saints and saints who know themselves to be sinners. So I think Spufford's kind of arguing for that kind of saints who know themselves to be sinners, who are aware of their brokenness, of their failure, and yet cling to the hope of a grace and a mercy that is prevailing and larger.
Okay, so you referred to the human propensity that he comes at later, and so I'll reference back to that in the preface. It's according to Amazon, I have purchased this book 14 times,
really,
and that is because I have given it away so many times. But it's been a couple of years since I've read it, and it's when I go back to when I went back to it again for like the umpteenth time, it struck me that so much of our culture, American culture, has changed since he wrote this book. That our context, that the post-Christian nature of American culture has accelerated since he wrote this book, and we more nearly approximate the culture that he was writing to originally, such that he had to write a different preface for Americans because their context he thought was so different. So that interested me, but I think this thing about language, because I know there are people who struggle with cursing in Christian literature and things like that, and it does feel like over the last few years our political discourse has become so coarsened that I don't know that maybe if Spufford wrote this book now, maybe he would make different decisions about that. But I think this is a good quote. To make a tonal point, or why do I swear so much in what you're about to read? To make a tonal point, to suggest that religious sensibilities are not made of glass, do not need to hide themselves nervously from whole dimensions of human experience, to express a serious and appropriate judgment on human destructiveness in a natural language of that destructiveness. But most of all, in order to help me nerve myself up for the foolishness in my own setting of what I'm doing, to relieve my feelings as I inflict on myself an undignified self-rejection from the protections of irony. I am an Englishman writing about religion. Naturally, I'm fucking embarrassed. I think that's so good on a number of levels. One is that we are a people, right? I mean, Tommy, you know this. Like, we are a people who we use irony to keep ourselves at arm's length distance from actual, genuine human emotions and vulnerability. Mm-hmm. That we do that. Tier, this language about stained glass language is something that we talk about on the podcast, and we're not referring just simply to like theological or churchy jargon. But there's a sense in which Christians use God talk as a way of distancing themselves from the vulnerabilities of actual human existence. And you can see that, like the way people talk in Bible studies versus how people talk in AA meetings often couldn't be more different. So that's what he's getting at here too. And Luther has a quote about how the curses of an impious person are more pleasing to God than the praises of an inauthentic pious person. And I think that's the sense here too, that he's connecting his language with his overall project and the book. That if you let Christian language do the work, it is a way of narrating how we experience the world truthfully. And so that's the sense in which he's using this four-lettered language. Would you guys say anything different to that or add anything?
I would just add, for those that have listened to Crackers and Grape Juice, you'll know that at the end of the podcast, we ask people what their favorite curse word is. And that's the question that most people stumble over the most. There's like this hesitancy that they hesitate about it so much because there's like this quick risk cost analysis happening, right? If I say something, am I going to lose people reading, or are people not going to buy whatever book I'm trying to sell? Are they not going to listen? Am I going to get angry emails from church people who more than likely aren't going to listen to the podcast, or at least that far into the podcast anyways? But it's just this moment of panic, and it can derail an entire conversation. But once they say that word that they would never say from the pulpit, they would never say from in front of their grandmother, right? For fear of getting, for what my grandmother would say would be getting smacked into next week, right? Once they say that word, there's this sense of relief, and they like come back to themselves. And it's as though whatever barrier they had up for the previous 45 minutes is gone. And as I say this, I wonder if it's the first question we need to ask in those interviews to get that guard down a little bit, so that we can not only keep God at arm's distance, but also not keeping one another at arm's distance.
Well, you'll notice that when I was interviewed on Crackers and Grape Juice, and you asked, I didn't hesitate.
But
I think
everybody listening judged you.
But I think that it relates to Jason's introduction of Pelagianism, because Pelagianism, in popular terms, ends up with people pretending to be perfect.
Yep.
Pretending to be somebody they aren't. And, I'm old enough, you guys, maybe this is no longer happening. I hope it isn't. But when I was a younger pastor, if I'd be someplace and somebody was having a beer, they'd put their bottle behind the couch. And if they said something like shit, they'd say, "Oh, I'm sorry, Reverend," And it's a very superficial kind of thing that it leads people to pretend to be some kind of moral perfection that is just self deluding.
My wife calls those moments for clergy to be social suicide, because in that moment, like Jason does this really well. He's always Jason, either an architect or an attorney in those situations, so that the person doesn't feel awkward, and it doesn't lead to that moment.
That's very kind of Jason.
He's very good at lying.
So okay, so
I don't know that.
We better.
What you said, Tony, was something I was going to bring up at the end, but it's appropriate here. On page 19 of the book, of my book. So we can say here that so if people participating tonight or listening later or watching later, there's a whole literature of apologetics in the Christian church where they are designed. Tommy, I'm sure, is familiar with these. To make an apology is to make an argument that Christianity is true, and almost always apologetics are done based on doctrine and reason. And so they'll they'll use a natural theology method to argue that, of course, the flood really happened, or of course Jesus was raised from the dead. And then they'll give you like evidence that demands a verdict, is, like books like that. What Francis Spufford is doing is he's flipping that around, and he's making an emotional argument for Christianity being, if not true, at least plausible. And what I think is interesting, so on page 19, he says, I assent to the ideas of Christianity because I have the feelings. I don't have the feelings because I've assented to the ideas. And I think this is incredibly important, so that like Christian doctrines, so like the Christian doctrine of original sin is important to Spufford in the following chapters, because it is a way of naming how he emotionally experiences the world. The way it most often happens in Christian traditions, especially like in evangelical and fundamentalist churches, that order gets flipped around. The doctrine is important, and therefore you have to argue it. And if you have any feelings that contradict that doctrine, you are encouraged to hide them. So doubt becomes a problem. And then any feeling that is contrary is somehow a failure on your part. So if you have doubts, that threatens the doctrine. If you are anxious, that means you're failing at something. If you don't feel any hope, that means you don't really believe, in God's sovereignty, for example. And so I think the ordering here is really, really important, that like Christian beliefs are important because they really do express how people experience the world. I can't remember who it was. I think it's Friedrich Schleiermacher who said that the Apostles' Creed starts with God the Father and works its way down to the Spirit and the Church, but how we experience God the Father works. It's like we have an experience of the Spirit through the Church. We experience the forgiveness of sins, and we work our way up through the Creed. And I think that's really good. So I think to get that ordering right, that feelings come first, and the doctrines name what we already felt in the world. So that's kind of the skeleton of the book. Tony, he begins chapter 1 on page 1 talking about his daughter growing up to know that her parents are weird. Not to single you out as the old guy on our panel, but you are the old guy on our panel. I mean, you just talked about dancing in the basement of a church. And so I'm wondering...
No less a Methodist church.
And so, and I imagine a lot of our participants in this class are of a certain age. And so they grew up in an American religious landscape that looked different than it does today. And so I'm wondering, like, in terms of how Christians are weird, can you name the difference that a lot of our listeners have maybe experienced without, and maybe it's changed so slowly they haven't really noticed the change?
Oh no, I think people have noticed. There's some regional differences in different parts of the country. I mean, our church-going percentage out here in the Northwest, I live in Seattle, is closer in what Spufford describes as the British experience. So it's a pretty aggressively secular culture in the Northwest. But I grew up in Arlington, where Tier is, and you kind of just thought everybody was a Christian, and the question wasn't really, are you a Christian, it's not, are you going to go to church? It's which church you go to. Now, we knew there were Jews and a few other things, but it was a pretty much a Christian culture, and we stopped living there. I don't know, quite some time ago, but in the Northwest today, people would ask me, what was it like to be a pastor out there? And I said, well, it was kind of, it was interesting. You were sort of exotic. People didn't quite know what to make of you. And so I think that's good. That's a good position to be in, to be a little more out of the mainstream and not, Spufford will talk about that a little bit. And they have the ironic situation of, the established church that nobody goes to in Britain, or almost nobody. But we don't live in the world of established Christianity or Christian culture, unless maybe there may be remnants of that or more of it in the southeast part of the United States.
Okay, so there's Riverside Church right on the edge of Harlem in Manhattan. There is a building right across the street from it where all the mainline Protestant church denominations used to have all of their administrative offices. So like the
so-called Godbox.
Yeah, the Godbox. So the United Methodist General Board of Global Mission was headquartered there until very recently. And the history of that building is fascinating because it was laid in the mid-50s. So it was built in the mid-50s.
54.
And there was a parade through Manhattan to celebrate the building of this building. And President Dwight Eisenhower laid the cornerstone for that building. And that was the apex of American religious or American church attendance. And it's been in decline ever since. But that you would have the president of the United States laying the foundation, like it just names a completely different world. And so I was just looking at our friend Ryan Burge, who's been on the podcast. He is a statistician. In 2020, a majority of Americans do not ever attend any worship services at all. And of the people who say they never attend, 18% identify as Democrats and 65% identify as Republicans. And just 8 years ago, it was only 36% of Republicans. And so this non-religious trend has like rapidly accelerated in one half of the country just in the last few years. So it's a completely different world than what you grew up in, Tony.
Right. But there is, even as it's a generally more secular and non-church going culture, there is this kind of fusion of Christianity with American nationalism that is I don't know what you'd call that, but it's so in another sense, there's a kind of different Christianity that is much more aggressive and tied in with kind of the American flag as being as much of a symbol of it as the cross ever.
Yeah, so we're not less religious. We just attend church. We're going to different churches.
Well, yeah, and some of them aren't churches at all. They're just rallies in stadiums, and meeting that, which is, I don't, I regret the fact I'm not for the fact that Christianity or that fewer people attend worship than they did, but it is what it is, and I think it gives the church an opportunity to be radical in a way that it didn't have during its most conventional, when it was most conventionally part of the culture.
Okay, so about that, Josh, you're up. On page 4, if you guys are following along in your books, I think this is an important quote. Spufford writes, "We're weird because we're inexplicable, because when there's no necessity for it that anyone sensible can see, we've committed ourselves to a set of awkward and absurd attitudes which obtrude, which stick out against the background of modern life, and not in some important or respect-worthy or principled way either, more in the way that some particularly stylish piece of dressing does, which makes the onlooker wince and look away and wonder if some degree of cerebral deficiency is involved. Believers are people with pudding bowl haircuts, wearing anoraks in August, and chunky knit sweaters the color of vomit. Or to pull it all back from the metaphor of clothing, to the bits of behavior that the judgment is really based on. Believers are people who try to insert Jesus into conversations at parties. He goes on, Josh, to talk about how we have a solution, the church, to a problem that people don't have. And so I know, Josh, like, you've read this, you're aware of this great big book by Charles Taylor, the philosopher, who talks about, the book is called The Secular Age. It's a very important book. And he talks about the immanent frame that we all live in. Can you kind of unpack that? Because that's what Spufford's talking about here.
To touch on it lightly, I would say two of the ways that we talk about God are being transcendent, being out there above, other, and immanent. Immanent, think, Jesus Christ, the incarnation. It's here, it's the reality right in front of you. Part of what Charles Taylor nods at is that the sea that we all swim in, Christians and non-Christians alike, the sea that we swim in is we see everything through the immanent frame. Most people are not going to accuse us of magical thinking, right? We don't believe that fairies inhabit the forest. The world is not enchanted to us in that way. And therefore, it limits the way that we see and experience. It's a set of lenses that we experience the world through. So again, we're all looking through that immanent frame.
That was good, Josh. That was good. Gold star. Another way of thinking about this is Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about religionless Christianity, about how God is dead. And what Bonhoeffer meant by that wasn't that God is like, not literally that there is no God, but that we live in a world that is ordered as if there is no God, and that Christians should just accept that is the world that we live in, and move forward. And so it just changes the nature of how Christians think about what we offer the world when we realize that we understand the world in a completely different way. So if you go back to Martin Luther, at the start of the Protestant movement, like Luther was on it, like he was going to become a lawyer, right? And he's on his way home, and he's caught in a lightning storm, and he's deathly afraid of dying, being struck by lightning. And so he prays a prayer to Saint Anne, please, Saint Anne, save me. And he doesn't die of lightning, and so he becomes a monk. That story encapsulates a completely different worldview than the worldview that people live in now, particularly in the West and in the United States and Europe. So carrying on in that idea tier, here's another important quote, I think. Spufford writes, most people don't have a God-shaped space in their minds waiting to be filled, or the new atheist counterpart, a lack of God-shaped space filled with the swirly, pungent vapors of polemic. Most people's lives provide them with a full range of loves and hates and joys and despairs, and a moral framework by which to understand them, and a place for awe and transcendence without any need for religion. Believers are the people touting a solution without a problem, and an embarrassing solution too, a really damp, palmed, wide smiling, can't dance solution. So Tier, you have been a youth in the church. You have been a youth director in the church. You are now an associate pastor in the church. Talk about how, so it's not just that the culture has changed. At the same time, in a lot of ways, church culture has not changed. And so talk about how what Spufford is writing about here should inform how we think about the attractional models. A, what is that? And then B, like the attractional models that the churches kind of orient themselves around.
Yeah, so the attractional model really works well in
what is it?
Oh, sorry. Traction models. I have something at the church that you can't get anywhere else. Imagine the days before Amazon. Example, it's Super Bowl Sunday next week. At my church, we rented a huge 40-inch television that you don't have at your home to come sit in the church basement and watch the Super Bowl. That's a kind of the church going into the secular world. Another example would be churches who turn their spaces into really cool, hip coffee shops. Here is this thing that you might be able to get somewhere else, but if you come here, you can get the same thing, and it has a little bit of Jesus sprinkled over top of it. It works really well when it comes to teenagers and children, because eventually the attraction loses its attractiveness and the person moves on. But the beauty of working with children and teenagers is children are always becoming teenagers, right? And people are always having children. So back when people would have children and then immediately come to the church to have them baptized, you had this steady stream of people flowing through. And you could then, because you had such great ministries, programs really for kids, parents would stay. So you had to have something flashier than the church next door. And so it was an unattainable success, because you're constantly either one-upping the person next door to you at the detriment to the kingdom of God, or you are having to one-up yourself, because one bouncy house at Easter is not enough if you've had 3 bouncy houses 5 years ago. And if the church down the street has 6 bouncy houses plus a mechanical bull, then you're in trouble. And in all of that, not once in the last 2 minutes have I said the words Jesus or gospel. And so the focus of the church comes away from the good news, the salvific work of God accomplished through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and inserts the attention of the church is in a place that, one, we are ill-equipped to insert ourselves into. And most attraction-based models, the stuff the church is getting involved in, they can't do well anyways, or any better than a for-profit corporation or business in their area. And it's not disciple making, which is what the church has been commissioned by Christ to do. So all of this attraction-based ministry, whether it was when I was a teenager, whether it was when I was a youth director, or now as churches are trying to find their footing in this new normal, where, what was it, Jason? How many people did Ryan Burge say don't go to church anymore? Like 80% of people now? Is that what it was?
I can't remember. Well, it's also
like whatever. It just passed the 50% marker. It's never gone.
Okay, below. It's like right.
But those people also lie.
Yeah, so like attraction-based ministry, it serves a purpose, but you're one, it's not the gospel, and two, you're doing more harm, because once you take the attraction away, you're either doing a bait and switch, which is not fair, right? How many people were like invited to church with like their friend as a teenager for like pizza and video game night, and then but before you get to play the video games, some guy in his early 20s got in front of the group and dimmed the lights and told this really manipulative story, and girls started crying, and so I'm a teenage boy and the girl puts her head on my shoulder. I think that's pretty cool, so I'm going to start crying, and then whatever he asks me to do, I'm going to do because of what's happening. It's just so manipulative, and it's not sustainable. Stop doing it. Preach the good news of the gospel.
I mean,
not me.
So all right, so a real simple example of an attractional model of ministry is Vacation Bible School, right? You send out cards to the community, maybe you put up signs, and so the assumption behind advertising Vacation Bible School to the wider community is that a number of people in the wider community have some sense that their children needs to have some connection to God for them to have a happy or a moral life. And what Spufford's naming here is that like more and more people don't think they or their children have to have that connection to something called God to have a happy or transcendent or meaningful life. And they think and honestly, they look at the stories of churches and Christians in the news, and they think there's probably a better chance of their children growing up to be moral, ethical people if they don't send their kid to school, right? Like, why am I going to send my kid to Jerry Falwell's Vacation Bible School? Like, so like it's not without merit, right? And so what Spufford's naming here is that the cultural resonance and the cultural valuation of Christianity is no longer present. It's more present in places like where Tommy is, in Oklahoma, maybe. But even that, I think the stats show how that's really kind of a facade as much as anything. And so, Tommy, you're up. Later in chapter 1 here, Spufford talks about a bus advertisement campaign that the New Atheists funded at the turn of the century, 21st century, where the buses, the billboards on the sides of the buses says, there's probably no God, just go on and enjoy your life, or something like that. And then Spufford gives us an imaginative alternative. He says, but suppose as the Atheist bus goes by that you were the 50-something woman with the Tesco bags. That's a grocery store in the United Kingdom, I discovered in Ireland, with the Tesco bags, trudging home to find out whether your dementing lover has smeared the walls of the flat with her own shit again. Yesterday, when she did it, you hit her, and she muled till her face was a mess of tears and mucus, which you also had to clean up. The only thing that would ease the weight on your heart would be to tell the funniest, sharpest tongued person you know about it. But that person no longer inhabits the creature who will meet you when you unlock the door. Respite care would help, but nothing will restore your sweetheart, your true love, your darling, your joy. So Tommy, first of all, I'm just interested in like how you reacted to this part of the chapter.
So this is my first time reading the book. And I'm also reading it as I'm kind of in a weird spot in my own journey of faith, I guess you could say. So as he went through these stories and stuff and kind of talked about how to say that there isn't a God means that we're going to enjoy life, I kind of was actually brought back to a similar thing that I was kind of raised with. Now it changed at a certain point growing up, but it was kind of the opposite. If you just believe in God, then you're going to enjoy your life. So it was kind of just reading these stories and kind of being like, but is it really a balm to fix going home to your love who's smeared their shit on the walls? Same thing with the person with the degenerative disease that he talks about and everything. Like it just made me think of, so often I think it's told to people that if you say your ABCs of your Vacation Bible School or whatever, then you do get the same enjoyment and you don't have all the emotions that he's talking about that come with life. So that's kind of the cynical version of like what I thought the whole time that I was reading that.
Yeah, I think his name is Chris Arnade. He's a photojournalist, and he did a book about 2 years ago now. And he's an Englishman too, actually, and he just decided he was going to travel around Rust Belt America and take photos of impoverished areas, like impoverished old factory towns and rural areas. And I ran into a lot of, people addicted to opioids and people with like 4 part-time jobs and things like that. And one of the things he discovered was how religious they all were. And he has a remark at the beginning of the book about how he felt indicted because he's an atheist, or he was, and how in large part his atheism was made possible by a relatively comfortable life that didn't need any outside source of help or hope. And again, I think, we talked that what he's tapping into here is that if, for example, the language of original sin, the language of original sin allows you, it should give someone, so someone who's lost their temper caring for someone who has constant needs. The doctrine of original sin should give you the language to forgive yourself when you lose patience with another person, right? But if, so often in our churches, original sin is either this abstract thing, or we just disavow it because we think it means people suck. When in reality, it's meant to say, well, yeah, a lot of times people do suck, and it's not your fault. And so, you can show your spouse some mercy, or you can be gracious to yourself, because you're not going to get it right.
Yeah. Something you said, Tommy, there made me think, going back to Jason and Tier talking about statistics, that we are no less religious as a society. We may be less Christian or a certain form of Christianity, but we're no less religious. There are people both in the church and people out in the world that are both trying to achieve transcendence by different means. So there is a form of Christianity that a big $5 word is like Deuteronomistic theology. Like the end of Deuteronomy says, if you do good, you'll get blessing. But if you do bad, you'll get cursing. And so people grow up with this simple idea of religion that I'm a good person and I do good and I have perfect attendance Sunday school ribbons on my suit coat, but then something happened in my life. My child was born with disease. I had to bury my teenage son. Something happens where all the wheels fall off, and why is this happening to me? And so we seek these means either through religion or through the world. In the world, I was talking to somebody earlier. I don't know if you guys know the name Bo Burnham. He's a secular music artist. He has this song called That Funny Feeling. And I thought this was interesting because we're talking about feelings and emotions. Call it irony, call it something's wrong with the world. Something's not right. But he paints this picture of, I'm going to go out and buy a stunning 8K resolution meditation app. Right? Why do I want to meditate? Because my life is filled with screens. But this app, it's so beautiful and crystal clear. It sounds. He talks about getting a book on self-help delivered to his doorstep by a drone. He's talking about the world at my fingertips while the ocean is at my door. And I can hear that both ways. I can hear that like I'm leaving the world outside because I'm too invested in this one. And I can also think of climate change, right? While I'm wrapped up in this, the ocean is getting closer and closer. But people are no less looking at the world around them and saying something's wrong. And what are we going to do about it? And I think that's where Pelagian comes in with this. We can do something about it. But what we end up doing is realizing we have a huge propensity to fuck up ourselves, right? And tying this back to Bonhoeffer and to Luther, Luther said, God doesn't need your piety. God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does. Your neighbor needs to be befriended and loved with a genuine love. And that mercy that Jason was talking about, that Francis Spufford talks about, that's lying underneath, like that adagio he's listening to Mozart in the coffee shop, right? That even though I've screwed things up in my relationship, there's this sense that something is still buoying me, something's still carrying me, giving me strength to go on. The thing that we hopefully sometimes catch glimpses of is that that's what God's been trying to tell us all along. I've got you. I know exactly who you are. You're not fooling anybody with your pretense. And yet I gave myself to the uttermost for you. I love you. Can I say that to my spouse? Can I say that to my neighbor who desperately needs not just to hear that, but to experience that kind of, man, I fucked up. I'm not going to abandon you. I know exactly who you are. I know I'm just as prone to screw up. Let's go through this together.
Thing I thought was interesting about that turn where he talks about the Atheist Bus slogan and whatnot is at the beginning of that paragraph. He's been doing a litany of all the accusations of Christians being kind of basically kind of embarrassing fools. And then he says, the funny thing to me is it's exactly the other way around. In my experience, it's belief that involves the most uncompromising attention to the nature of things of which you are capable. It's belief that demands you dispense with the illusion after illusion, while contemporary common sense requires continual fluffy pretending. And I think, then he brings up these examples that you mentioned, Tommy, of human suffering. And to me, I guess one of the reasons that I found Christianity compelling as a young adult was that it didn't ask me to pretend people don't suffer. It didn't ask me to pretend even that good people don't suffer. I mean, or that terrible things happen. And I think what he's contrasting here with his long kind of thing on just enjoy your life, God probably doesn't exist, is that's a very limited view of life. It's kind of a consumer, just you get enough stuff and you'll be happy and enjoy it, skate on through. That's not really the way life is. And he's arguing that faith, as he understands it, is in some ways a much more realistic assessment of what we live with than kind of pretending everything is just hunky-dory and that we're hunky-dory.
Yeah, I mean, Tony and Josh, you guys are old enough to religious funerals are far more emotionally healthy than funerals of people who don't believe, because there is there's just, for example, so there's a spiritual wisdom and a realness, an everyday realism for people who have prayed ceaselessly every day for a period of time for someone to get better, and then they die. Like, that person has done more hard thinking and emotional work than someone whose lack of faith hasn't put them in a position to do that. So I think Spufford's exactly right that belief forces you into a position of having to pay attention to the details of life. And then, and to bring that out further, I think what he's doing here, so much of our political discourse in America, I think, is informed by the absence of what he's trying to do here, right? So that, so on the left, we have this, a religion of wokeness that has the language of sin without the mechanism of mercy. And then on the right, you have the language of righteousness and tradition without the acknowledgement that human sinfulness infects not just human hearts, but institutions itself. And therefore it's not just a few bad apples that shoot unarmed Black people. It's, of course a police department could be corrupt, because the human propensity to fuck things up is not just an individualistic thing. It's something that affects all of us. So I think his focus on Christianity as a way of naming how we emotionally experience the world, I think, is incredibly fruit-bearing. So that is 56 minutes of us talking. Tier, do we have questions?
We have one question.
One question.
Well, okay, to be fair to our dear listeners, before you start scolding them, they were not instructed to ask questions using the question function on the Zoom toolbar at the beginning of this program. The first question, the question we have coming, it's talking about secularism. I'll read it. Where is God hidden and working through the secularism of the world? How is he using it for his plan for all his people?
That sounds like a question for Tony.
I don't know about, well, I think, most of my years of ministry have been in a time when people have been preoccupied with the decline of the church and the loss of its social clout, that as the example of Dwight Eisenhower laying the cornerstone of the Godbox, or I taught for a time in Canada, and the people used to say the United Church of Canada's head was always waiting for the prime minister to call for advice, and the prime minister wasn't calling anymore. So I think losing that has, for me personally, it's made Christianity less about just trying to be good citizens or really good citizens, and more about a reliance on the kind of grace that Spufford experiences on a really bad day when he hears the Mozart clarinet concerto, and it kind of, I think he says in there someplace that it doesn't deny the depths that he's experiencing, but it reminds him that there is more, and that and I guess one way I put it, sometimes there's more grace in God than there is sin in us, and
that's sure about
that. And I don't think in the attraction model that Tier talks about, really an attempt to redo Christendom over again, to redo the semi-established church, and I think God is working through this dismantling to bring us to something that is hopefully deeper and better and more interesting, and honest. So,
Tommy, tell people what a cowboy church is. This is because this is an example of something that is church, but it is thoroughly secular.
I mean, it's down the street from the church I attend. It is all King James. It's very political, very right-wing Republican. They usually have cops out front just in case.
They have book burnings every Friday night.
Pretty much, yeah. They're going to be all the anything left, people anti-mask, anything similar to that. Yeah, they're interesting people for sure.
It sounds like the biker church that was across the street from the previous church I served, which oddly enough, because it was attraction based, didn't last very long.
And then, Tommy, what is Life Church? Because that's a different iteration of the same thing.
So Life Church is a mega church out here. It is going to be multi-campus. It is going to be very come in and get your ABC for how you can do better the next week, or your 3 bullet points. They even have your notes already typed out for you with the blanks. That way you can fill it in, and you can go to church online. Same similar setup, like nothing very deep.
So a theologian, priest, pastor, Leslie Newbegin, was an English Anglican priest who was a missionary in India for a number of years. Wrote some important books, and then this is during the 20th century. And then he came back to England, and he was like, he was shocked by how secular the church was. And one of the things Newbegin said was, so in England, in Francis Spufford's England, the Christian church was established officially by the government. But in America, the founding fathers had the even better idea of, let's not establish it, but let's tolerate it. So what happened in America is that the Christian church was effectively the established religion of the church. And so in England, you have, the Queen is the head of the church, and bishops serve in the House of Lords, and like all these trappings. When like a royal gets married, you have a celebrity quasi-Christian funeral that's on TV, and like those things. In America, you have mega churches that are premised not on the gospel, but on like either like people's like political preferences, like in Patriot Church, and there's plenty of examples on the left too. Or you have mega churches like Life Church, that are built by identifying people's felt needs and then building it up from there, which is the same way that like Robert Schuller's church was built. Like Robert Schuller literally went from house to house asking people like, what would it take for you to come to church? And so so it's like, it's anthropomorphic, it's human centered. And just because they're using God talk doesn't mean it's not just as secular as the person who's watching Meet the Press on Sunday morning and would never send their kid to vacation Bible school. So Josh, you wanted to add something to that question?
Oh, I wanted, if it's all right, I'd love to, in lieu of not beginning with a song, I'd love to close with a song that I think speaks to both, was it Miley's question? The question about how is God working in the secular world? But it's also just a really beautiful story. So do y'all mind if I close and we kind of watch this thing together?
So before you close, just a random thought I had too, and Tony, you can chime in maybe. So like another way of like thinking about that question, and this speaks to like Tommy's like her in-between place and how she feels about church, is that if we believe that God is active in the world, and as I tried to like say on Sunday, the God of the Bible is never not intervening in the world, then rather than interpreting the decline of the church as a failure, something that we're not doing right, which is kind of a Pelagian way of approaching the problem, maybe we should be thinking that, as Stanley Hauerwas likes to say, God is killing the church.
Making us leaner and meaner.
or as, so it's like, we love to talk in the mainline church about how God is a liberator, that God is whoever raised Jesus from the dead, having first raised Israel from Egypt, right? Like we love to identify God as the one who frees his people. We conveniently leave out the fact that after a few generations sojourn in the promised land, God decided to send them back to a different Pharaoh to teach them a lesson. And so God seems to be less interested in our liberation and more interested in our faithfulness. And so, if we believe that God is sovereign and active in our world and the church is in decline, maybe it's because God is judging us for the compromises we have made, both in like outward fidelity and then also in like stifling people's ability to emotionally name how they really experience the world. So that is just one way I would name that. So Josh, take it away.